Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're so excited to have you on the Black Leadership panel. I am thrilled, like beyond thrilled, to be moderating an incredible panel with such incredible speakers. And so I'm going to launch right in knowing we have a finite amount of time to answer some very hard and very complex questions. We all know, many of us in the nonprofit sector, since the murder of George Floyd in May 2020, we've really seen a mobilization of Black Lives Matter, the movement globally, but we've also really seen COVID-19 as a pandemic magnify existing cracks and inequities in our social and economic systems. As a nonprofit sector, we're really at a critical juncture, and I think there's a really critical question on the table. What is the nonprofit sector's role in addressing and fighting against systemic anti-Black racism? Here's what we know about Black communities and about the sector in general. One, that Black Canadians of African descent, make up 3% of Canada's population. And that 3% of Canada's population comes from 200 different ethnic and cultural origin-based groups. The idea of being Black is not homogenous. For those of you who are just coming to this for the first time, I'd really recommend you start digging into, when you say Black, why we think of one general or homogenous group. We know, for those of us in Ontario, that 50% of Canada's Black community is located within the province of Ontario. So for all of us here today, we have an obligation to engage with Black communities in a different way than we have before. We also know that Black people are the largest recipients of services that are provided by the nonprofit sector in Ontario, while also working in the sector. And the sector is mostly led by women. Black women are often represented in social services and the health subsectors. We know that 1/3 of Black women work in healthcare and social assistance. And Black employees aged 15 or over are more likely than their counterparts in the rest of the population to report experiencing unfair treatment, discrimination, and anti-Black racism at work. So without a doubt, these questions are much more pressing than ever. And knowing these facts, the question that we're putting on the table to all of you is the nonprofit sector really ready to do this work? My name is Hawa. I'm the Executive Director at Canadian Feminist Alliance for International Action. And I'm joined again, as I shared with you as I came in, by some incredible speakers who are with us today. I'm going to go through and share a little bit briefly about their bios, and then hopefully we'll dive right into the session and the questions. We've got a lot of terrain to cover in a very short amount of time. So I'll start first with Debbie Owusu-Akyeeah, who's the Executive Director for Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity. Debbie is a Black feminist with over 8 years of local and international advocacy experience in a variety of roles, ranging from programming and counseling to policy analysis and project management. We have also joining us Paul Taylor. Paul is the Executive Director of Foodshare Toronto, a lifelong anti-poverty activist. Growing up materially poor in Toronto, Paul has used his experience to fuel a career focused not just on helping others, but dismantling the beliefs and systems that lead to poverty and food insecurity, including colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchal structure. And then we have Sané Dube. She's the Manager, Community and Policy at UHN Social Medicine. She's a policy analyst and a knowledge broker, and committed to reducing disparities in health access experienced by marginal communities. And last but not least, we have Jama, who is a community organizer from Hamilton, Ontario. She's the co-founder of the Disability Justice Network of Ontario. Her lived experiences have fostered interest and a passion for community engagement, disability justice, and activism. In her spare time, she acts as a consultant, and she's currently working with the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board to create anti-racism training and peer support-based curriculum for students at the school board. So before we launch into the first question, want to make a couple of things clear as we move through. One, despite some common narratives that are out there, we're really not here to debate the existence of systemic racism or anti-Black racism. We're talking about it as an indisputable fact. So really, if folks are here to say, let me play devil's advocate, let me dismiss the experiences of people who have lived anti-Black racism, we're not there anymore, and we're not going to start there as part of this conversation. So I'd encourage all of you to dive in deep, engage with the learning, throw in some questions if you have things that you're curious about, and we're happy to answer them near the end of our conversation today. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to first start by asking the panel to work with us to define some concepts at the very beginning. So what is anti-Black racism? And more importantly, how does it manifest itself both explicitly and implicitly in all of our subsectors? And maybe Sané, I can start with you and ask specifically for you to comment on health.
Okay, hi everyone. Hawa, thank you so much. I'm so glad to be in discussion with you. You are brilliant. And yeah, everyone who's on this panel is brilliant. So I think you're asking what anti-Black racism is and how it manifests. I think right now we're in a pandemic and we are seeing very clearly what anti-Black racism, the effects of it. Most of the people who are disproportionately impacted by this pandemic in Ontario are Black and racialized people. We know that in Northwest Ontario, despite increasing numbers, there has not been a specific strategy that addresses those neighborhoods. We know that rates of COVID are going up in Toronto, in Peel, in regions where we know that a lot of Black people live. And really, this was just another way that anti-Black racism manifests. Anti-Black racism is systemic and structural disempowerment and lack of resources and care, really care for Black people, our health conditions and the ways that we move through this world. Anti-Black racism is really something that undermines Black life, that makes our lives unlivable. And I think that the pandemic that we're in really clearly shows what anti-Black racism looks like on a systemic and structural level. I'll hand back to you.
Thanks. Maybe actually I'll flip it over to Paul. I wonder if there's anything you want to add to that.
Sure. Maybe the first thing I'll say is I want to acknowledge that the term anti-Black racism was coined by a brilliant Black woman, Dr. Akwa Benjamin, from a professor at the School of Social Work at Ryerson University. And I think Sané put it beautifully, what anti-Black racism is. I can talk a little bit about anti-Black racism and how it intersects with food insecurity in this country. So Foodshare wanted to understand this, so we partnered with U of T, Proof out of U of T, to explore the data on food insecurity that looked specifically at the experiences of Black Canadians. And what we found was that if you're Black in Canada, you're 3.5 times more likely to be food insecure or live in a food insecure household than if you're white. 12% of white children live in food insecure households versus 36% of Black children. Now that, to me, is horrific enough, but what we found after that really challenged how we think about food insecurity in this country. And I think speaks to the need for disaggregated race-based data, because this is the first time there was a project that was done like this that we've been able to glean in the country. So what we found, typically when we talk about food insecurity in this country, we recognize that if you own a home, you're less likely to be food insecure. That makes a lot of sense. Except if you're Black in Canada, the percentage of Black homeowners, 14.3% of Black homeowners are food insecure, which is almost equivalent to the 14.5% of white renters that are food insecure. There were a whole bunch of other things that really underscored, anti-Black racism. I'll just point to one other that really jumped out at us. It was social assistance. We saw that white folks receive more in social assistance than Black folks do in this country. We didn't understand why. We thought, welfare is something you punch in the numbers, something spits out. But found that actually, of course, it includes in Ontario and across the country, disability income supports. So what that's telling us is that white folks are more likely to be approved for disability, and when they are approved, they're approved for more. So there's so many ways that these inequities show up when it comes to food, and it's simply down to anti-Black racism.
So there are some cross-cutting pieces, right? So we're talking about health, we're talking about food insecurity, but we can immediately start to see all the other institutions that begin to become deeply embedded in how Black people are experiencing anti-Black racism in our world. And maybe there's a link there for you, Sarah. I think Paul touched on a couple of pieces that I wonder you could speak to in your subsector.
I mean, when you're talking about anti-Black racism in the sector in general, I can think of a lot of examples. One of the examples that jumps out to me right now is the fact that Doug Ford put $1,000 into the Anti-Racism Directorate and basically undid a lot of the work that Michael Cotu did. Not to say that what he was working on was perfect, but he put in like millions of dollars toward Black youth that was rolled back really quickly when the conservative government got elected. I can also think of other examples how Black people come into this sector wanting to help our people, right? We're told like, a lot of us grew up using these sectors, these resources on social assistance. So we come into this world thinking, okay, we can do a lot of good. But then we're told not to bite the hand that feeds us. How can you do this work? And then also talk about policing and also talk about like anti-Black racism in real tangible ways in our school systems. You're just supposed to go in and talk politely to youth and, you know, make people feel comfortable, right? That's what we're told. So you come in thinking one thing, and then you're told not to bite the hand that feeds you. And I think that's inherently anti-Black, right? A lot of these sectors could be doing a lot more to target the underpinnings of racism in and of itself, but we're not allowed to, because if you do, then you're at risk of being defunded and your work being destroyed, so.
Thank you, Sarah. Debbie, I'm wondering if there's anything you want to add to this question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can definitely touch on it from the perspective as someone who's working in the LGBTQ sector. I think when I think of anti-Black racism, it's really difficult for me to not talk about it in relation to white supremacy and how it manifests itself, but specifically moving away from what we're taught white supremacy is. Like a lot of people think it's some people with like a white cloak, etc. I'm like, no, we're talking about power. We're talking about who makes decisions, who has money, who has influencing power, and who just has the resources. And when I think of where anti-Blackness comes in, it is like the systemic process of preventing us from having any access to that. And it's a very, very calculated and intentional thing. And when I think about it in the context of nonprofit sector, and I'll be talking a lot about my experience. I just joined CCGSD, my organization, in July. So I like to contextualize myself in it because I think I'm a great case study. But part of it too that we see is like white supremacy culture and like power hoarding and this like fear of any suggestions. And I think Sarah touched on it a little bit, like, you know, biting the hand that feeds you. A suggestion, which is a normal thing that an executive director should be doing on like possible changes, is seen as a threat. And I often think about what happens when that suggestion is coming from a Black person, let alone a Black woman, and like how things get then, we're punished. And in my organization, Black women have historically provided suggestions to change things, especially with how we're reaching out with Black queer community across the country, and have been punished. And so I often think about that, and I think about it in the broader context of the national LGBTQ movement, because it is overwhelmingly white. And that is something that I knew, but got a taste of kind of sitting at the table with other LGBTQ organizations that are national. It is overwhelmingly white, it's overwhelmingly male. And before I joined, the only other white-led organization was run by a Black man. And I think it's important to recognize that like the influencing power that national LGBTQ orgs have, because they get a seat at the table, they get to influence policy and legislation. And when we are not on it, at the table itself, we are being served for dinner. And that's something to be said there. And so when I think about anti-Blackness in the context of my sector, I'm thinking about how often there is like a hesitancy for queer and trans people who are white to talk about white supremacy and how they benefit from it. Although we do share that same oppression of being queer and trans, they benefit from it. And there's a quote that my friend shared with me that I think is hilarious, but I think definitely encapsulates things. It's a lot of upholding white mediocrity in the name of queer liberation within the nonprofit sector. And that is dangerous. And it's dangerous because white people end up getting jobs. White people get to influence policy. They get the writing gigs where they're writing news articles, et cetera. And as a result, the data that can impact us as a community, we're not there. And it's also reflective of this very weird narrative that like, we're somehow not queer or trans, we're just Black in itself. And 2016, with the action from Black Lives Matter Toronto, was a clear indication, especially the backlash, that we are not seen as also queer and trans, and that it's dangerous when those same people are the ones who are leading, you know, the work and in this industry that somehow is supposed to benefit us. And so I see it from this perspective. It's scary, but I am trying, and I'm luckily enough to have people who are encouraging me. But I do believe that there is a reckoning that needs to happen within the LGBTQ sector in Canada that we're not seeing, where we're naming anti-Blackness as a big, big issue, and that there's just not enough of us who are at the leadership table, but let alone our issues being at the forefront. And I think there's something to be said as the people who are giving other LGBTQ activists the language, the clout, let's be honest, because proximity to us gives people clout when it comes to our movements, where we do all of this stuff, but we are nowhere getting the benefits that we should be, because white supremacy is privileging, but also protecting other people. And so there needs to be a reckoning from my perspective, and a lot of change too.
Thank you for that, Debbie. Very powerful. And I think leads us really naturally into this next conversation or question, which is proximity is clout. I love that. And I think, especially when we're thinking about how the nonprofit sector is responding to systemic racism and anti-Black racism, we're seeing representation also function as clout or a lack of responsibility or accountability towards actually addressing anti-Black racism. We've hired a Black leader, right? Because that's the full stop. We've hired a Black leader and we're kind of done the work we're doing around anti-Black racism. And so I'm curious for all of you, if you're able to share some examples in your own experience where nonprofits have come up with solutions for anti-Black racism. Have they worked? Have they not? What are some functional ways that we could address anti-Black racism as a systemic and structural issue in the nonprofit sector moving forward? And I won't direct it, I'll leave it open, whoever wants to jump in.
I think one of the things that we need to do is like really be critical of where our money is coming from. Like this sector, like this philanthropic like sector of like intergenerational wealth being funneled into community foundations and then being handed out, like where did that money come from, right? And who's deciding where that money will go? I think one of the things I really like about the States is that there's a lot of progressive private foundations that are handing out money to good work, whereas here it's usually government funded or by giant like community foundation places. And I think really analyzing like where they got that money from and where did it come from and how are they dictating where it goes is the first step to like really figuring out how to, because there's no point in taking money that you're going to be tied to that you cannot really like make long-term change with. And I think another thing that we need to focus on is really looking into ways where we can do work that means something, even if we are afraid to, because a lot of organizations want to do stuff. But like in Hamilton, there are very few Black-led organizations that are actually tackling issues that matter with regard to racism in our city. Like they're doing a lot of good work that's charity minded for Black people, but that's not the same as tackling anti-Black racism. But I think this nonprofit sector combines the two. So I've heard things like, you know, being Black-led in an organization, according to like the liberal government, means having Black people as staff, Black people on the board, right? But it's not actually looking at what you're doing to combat racism in and of itself in any of the granting, right? So what are you actually doing to push causes ahead? But I'll see organizations that are Black-led that get like triple the funding who aren't actually doing long-term change around the issues they're getting the money for. And around like representation, it's not enough to just be Black. It's actually frustrating because some organizations are doing work on the front line to make sure people are being fed, that mutual aid is a thing, that police are being held accountable. And then some organizations are just sitting comfortably, right? And reaping the benefits of that and being able to fundraise off of being a Black-led organization. So I think we need to like sort of separate and be more specific in terms of what it means to be Black-led that's for Black people.
I agree with Sarah. I think that the politics of just saying representation is enough is doing so much harm to our communities because we're in a place where people will say, oh, but we have a Black person who's there. And meanwhile, that Black person is essentially being, in some cases, set up to fail. And then also in some cases doesn't actually have the power to do things that will improve the lives of Black people. So I think that we need to shift from somewhere where we are talking about the values that people bring to the work that they're doing and talking about the long-term commitments that they're making in the sector. I also think a lot about, and this happens a lot in health, I'll give the example of, Paul, you mentioned the collection of race-based data, which is something that we advocated for quite a bit at the beginning of this pandemic. The government did say that they would start collecting race-based data, but then as they started that process, they did something which was very harmful, which was that they cherry-picked Black people who they could put on these committees to talk about how the data was collected. And so I think that that's another way that nonprofits can be harmful in some ways, in that you say you'll do something, but then you cherry pick specific Blacks who are supposed to represent the needs of a very diverse, very heterogeneous community. So I think that we need to move away from this idea that just having a Black person in the room is enough. We need people who are actually committed to improving Black people's lives. We need people who have a history of actually doing this work in their communities. And then we also need to fund the organizations, like Sarah said, where we can see that they're making an impact and actually changing the ways that Black people are living.
One thing I might add, or maybe a couple things that I might add too, is that, first of all, I just love being on this panel. Maybe before I dive in, I feel like I'm at home. This is so good. This is so good. Challenging anti-Black racism is an ongoing process that requires ongoing attention. The same way that white supremacy has been an ongoing project that has been well-resourced and nurtured for hundreds of years. So I think leaders that are thinking about what can we be doing to tackle anti-Black racism, it's about putting some budget dollars towards what you're hoping to accomplish, but a longer-term commitment. The second thing, I think it's really important that people recognize that, challenging anti-Black racism isn't just about ensuring that white people are nice to the Black people that they work with. It's truly, as has been mentioned, recognizing the systems that reinforce anti-Blackness in our own institutions and actually coming up with a plan to work to dismantle them. And recognizing sometimes that, the intersecting issues here, income justice, economic justice, that's a huge part of tackling anti-Black racism. So when, one of the things that we're doing at Foodshare is, as we think about tackling anti-Black racism, we recognize that the lowest paid workers in the food system are often Black and brown. The same is true of our organization. So when we introduce what some might see as an economic justice intervention, where we gave the folks at the bottom of the pay grid a 25% increase, folks at the top of the pay grid, no increase, those are the types of things we've got to be thinking about and talking about when we're challenging anti-Black racism. We've got to be talking about relying less on contract or casual labor. And I think much more transparency, where, Black folks have been engaged with this sector, engaged with these systems and institutions for a long time, and there's a lot of distrust. So I think having things like transparent pay grids, putting out how much are you going to pay people for the jobs you're hiring them for? And I think I'm going to challenge nonprofit leaders on this call to really think about developing a lowest paid to highest paid ratio. We have one of those at Foodshare. The highest paid worker at Foodshare can make no more than 3.7 times the lowest paid worker. These are all the types of interventions, the types of conversations that we need to have if we're going to make the sector supportive, inclusive, and welcoming to our beautiful Blackness and our brilliance.
I think my co-panelists have said a lot of what I wanted to share. And just to add, I think and I think, Paul, you touched on it, on the distrust. That is a huge, huge thing. And I've been talking about this a lot with people about what happens to Black folks who have to deal with harm in this sector, and the fact that we are leaving the nonprofit sector in droves, because a sector that we think is supposed to align with our values, and usually does at the start, often causes some harm that forces us to leave. And I often tell this to people, I'm like, it is not a coincidence that there's a lot of Black women, especially in Canada, who are starting their own consultancy firms, because it's better for them to feel safe as their own boss than working in an industry that is somewhat hypocritical. I won't even say somewhat, there's a lot of hypocrisy there. And I think that trust thing is a very, 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 very hard thing, because once it's broken, regaining it is difficult. And I'll again use my example within my organization. We're currently going through anti-racism training. And I bring that up because I think a lot of people post May 2020 are doing anti-racism training. I've been booked and busy. I'm sure a lot of the folks in this call too have been booked and busy, being brought in by other organizations to do training. And our training was a direct response to some anti-Blackness that did happen. And the thing that has stood out with the process is that the facilitator, who is brilliant in my opinion, has actively decided to have interviews with former Black staff to see if anti-racism was the reason why they left. I would like to encourage the other nonprofit leaders in this call, if you are going through anti-racism training, I don't know if that has been part of the framework with the facilitators you're working with, but I highly suggest that might be something you do, because I think there will be a lot to be said on what your organization may not have been set up to do to retain those Black people in your organization and in the sector. There's a lot of information there, and it's something that I think we need to think about. And I think the trust issue comes in, because I think a lot of people in the sector are going to, well, let's just do a training because, you know, something bad happened. And whenever someone decides to do a training, there's always a backstory, and it's usually because of harm that was caused. And I know it's a difficult thing to be said, but like, if you've caused harm, regaining trust might never happen. And I think sometimes we need to talk about stepping away from that role if you've caused harm, because your presence can continue to get in the way of any structural changes that could happen. And I know it's hard to say, hi, let go of your power, but that's part of the conversation that I think we need to have. And I think doing these things with your anti-racism training, where they're specifically linked to your strategic planning, your strategic goals, where you're measuring them, are important. And also speaking to the people who've left, because I think they will have a lot to say now that they don't have a fear of repercussions because they've left. And so I just wanted to add those things, because I think they definitely touch to this conversation piece. And they definitely reflect some of the things that I'm currently going through and engaging with the former racialized staff to see what we can do so we can build a very authentic anti-racism action plan with our strat plan.
Can I just add something real quick also?
Yes.
I'm thinking about, so many Black people have been impacted by things like colonization, slavery, which has led to a lot of fracturing in our families. So you'll find Black families who live in all sorts of places. I think that a simple way of actually being an anti-racist organization can also be in things that are around like policies around family leave, and how you support your workers, because someone whose whole family is here will have very different needs around things like family funerals or needing to take leave to care for sick parents. I think it's a very specific thing, but it also, I think that what anti-Black racism, what we should try and address is to really see the humanity of Black people. And that is one way that can be done in an organization. So to honor that, like, people may need more support than someone else around things like family care and leaves and that type of thing. And some organizations also will do where you pay your Black employees a certain percentage above the salary that you've given them, just to recognize that often Black people are working in anti-Black environments. So it's not a common thing, but I mean, it's also something that could be considered as an anti-Black, we know you're navigating this, so maybe we'll offer a fee above what your salary is.
I'll echo two things that I think are really interesting. I don't think it's scary. Give up your power, do it right away, and do it authentically in solidarity with the work that you're trying to do. And anti-Black racism tax, yes, absolutely. The cost and consequence on people's lives, Sané, as you referred to, is so significant, although it might not feel or look significant to those who are not living with systemic racism on the day-to-day. So paying people more, making sure there's space to expand policies. COVID-19 is a great example. Writing in a 14-day, sick day, if anybody gets COVID, when we see that Black people are disproportionately impacted by COVID, you can see that the impact for Black communities around making enough money to survive during this time is stark. So these are very concrete, I think, easy ways to shift forward, and others have put them in. And I don't mean easy in terms of time intensive. It's up to all of you to go back to your organizations and figure out how to make it easier. But I mean easy in terms of these are clear actions. They're not, they don't live in outer space. They're very clear. They're here, they're on the table. People can implement. I am curious, Paul, you kind of started this process, but we know that the nonprofit sector, and this is like a shameful private secret nobody says, so let me be one of the people to say it publicly, is very, very white the further up you go. Sitting at senior leadership tables, we know without a doubt the executive directors in the sector, the senior leaders, the board of directors, the folks designing the policy, the funders are all white, right? And we know they're also white women. So there's a real problem here around what we're doing around that diversity checklist too. And I'm sure I'm speaking to all the people who are here, and you know this. Look at your own organizations. You could figure this out pretty well. And for all of you here today as panelists, I'm curious, so what's your message? There's 190 people on this call, lots of them senior leaders and executives, a great chunk of them likely white. What's your direct message to some of these leaders around anti-Black racism on how to go beyond this equity and diversity and inclusion moment to do something substantial around anti-Black racism? And I wonder, Sarah, if we could maybe start with you.
I think for me, it would be like really sit down and think about what you're doing and why. Are you doing work just to meet your granting mandates, or are you doing work because it's meaningful? I have a really good friend who always says, just do the work and the money will come. And I really, really believe that. If you're doing good work, the money will find you. But if you're doing work just so that you can, if you're applying for things just because a grant came out and you want to do that work just because that grant came out, like what's your long-term vision here? Are you really there to help Black people? I'm less focused on the idea of like hiring Black people. Like that's important, but like many people will not be helped because you hired just one Black person. Like I think that's a cool goal, but outside of that, how are you actually shifting your strategic vision to like support Black people in the long run, right? Especially as things are getting worse around anti-Black racism, white supremacy, Islamophobia, sexism, ableism. Like how are you actually targeting the key issues? Like, I don't know, the pandemic was brought up a lot in terms of how Black people are affected, but even looking at Black people, like who are the most affected when we're talking about people who are being affected by COVID-19, and it's like disabled Black people, right? People who are not likely to have jobs right now, people who are forced onto social assistance, legislated into poverty on social assistance, like legally, right? And then these are the same people who will likely be given access to like medical assistance in dying should they actually like get COVID, right? And this legislation is going to be passed finally in December. And so I'm really worried about like the long-term future of Black people in Ontario and Canada, and what are the ways we're actually like working together to like target these real issues versus doing what we think is important because a grant came out. I think we need to get out of that mindset. I know we're forced to, but if we work together and actually talk about things as a community before we apply to grants, we can be way more proactive in terms of outcomes than we will if we're just applying willy-nilly because we're trying to keep our organizations.
Go ahead, Paul.
I would love to jump in on. Sarah just got me thinking about something, that often it's about doing the work and the money will come. Well, often we have no choice. Like I think for white folks on the call that have control over purse strings, really think about what it's like to be a Black person, to have to go and beg a white-led foundation for a few dollars to do a project that's going to benefit the Black community. Just give us the money. Just call us up and say, you know what, we see that you're doing the work, we're going to give you the money. And I'm pleased to say that there are foundations that are doing that, that are calling us up and saying, how can we help? No big application. They recognize that our organizations are often struggling with capacity as it is, because white-led organizations are over-resourced. A couple other things I want to just come back to around, I've heard a few folks talk about developing kind of action plans and things like that. And we've done the same. I think that's really important. I think it's one of the things that I've gotten some feedback on in terms of our action plan is that we've included deadlines when people can, it's on our website so folks can see it. And and thank you, Hawa. I want to thank Hawa for being a huge part of our process and our journey challenging anti-Black racism in our workplace. We reached out to Hawa and she was such an amazing help. So on behalf of the Foodshare team, I want to thank you for that too. But having deadlines and then also build into your plan. What happens when the organization doesn't meet those deadlines? Who do they talk to? So build in an accountability piece. If any person feels that the organization is not working fast enough, not adhering to the deadlines, build in a process for how that gets escalated. I think that's really important. I also, I talked a little, also resource this work, put it in your multi-year budget. It's not a one-off workshop. It's not a one-day training. We can't challenge hundreds of years of white supremacy with a one-day workshop. So I think resource it, build in accountability measures, and that's a good place to begin.
I'm going to hop on to what Paul said, just to talk about resourcing the work. I'll give the example of the work that's being done by Black Creek Community Health Center and Rexdale in response to COVID. These are two organizations, community-led health organizations, who saw what was happening with COVID. They saw that there was not a lot of intervention that was happening in their communities. So they actually created programs which were around testing in their communities and making sure that people were getting the help that they need. And they did this because they saw that the communities needed this. It took a really long time for these organizations to actually get the support that they needed. I think Mayor Tory and the Premier only just visited Black Creek 2 weeks ago. They've been doing this work for a while in the pandemic. So I think as a sector, we need to honor the work that organizations are doing to improve Black life. We need to fund it. And then as a sector, we need to also stand in solidarity with organizations that are doing this. The sector, and I come from the community health sector, I think it should have been important for that sector very early on in the game to be saying, we see the work that Rexdale is doing, and we want this work to be funded. We see the work that Black Creek is doing, we want it to be funded, and to hold our leaders accountable for that. So I think that the sector does have a role to see the work that Black leaders are doing. I used to support, I just until very recently worked in the community health sector, and I used to support Black EDs in that sector who are developing a Black health strategy. There's tremendous expertise. There's tremendous work that is being done. Even if we're here in Toronto, we're talking about organizations like Women's Health in Women's Hands, which is led by Lorianne Greenwalker, Parkdale Queen West, which is led by Angela Robertson. These are organizations that are doing a lot around COVID. For example, Parkdale is doing a huge housing project right now. They're also very active in the response to the opioid crisis, and they understand their communities. We need our sector to support the work that people are doing and to stand in solidarity and advocate for our organizations to be funded and for people who are actually the experts on the ground to have the tools that they need to do their work.
And I think for me, I'm in a unique position myself, not only being in a new executive director role, but I also sit on several boards, one of them in particular as board chair for a women's shelter here. And when I think about like the role that senior management, but then also board of directors can play, like we can play a huge role in like setting the not agenda, but I guess the tone when it comes to transformational change in organizations. And I think of, I feel like it's very like African of me to be like, how are you setting up your house so people are enjoying their stay? But like, I think it's an analogy for us to like actually think about when it comes to our work. And I think about it especially if we're going to talk about like beyond the recruitment, but I'm very focused on like retention. And I think it's because I do see the power of having Black staff and Black leadership, but then also making sure that they are set up to enjoy their stay in the sector, but in the organization. And I think there is something to be said when the few Black folks who are in senior leadership positions being able to create that culture. And I know that it's a lot of work on us, but like you don't take for granted the fact that we can do it, and that I'm constantly always thinking about my staff and making sure I'm setting things up and not being afraid to like let people know if the organization that I'm in isn't going to be safe for them, to be like, I don't think you should come here. There's still work that needs to be done, and like giving people that message. So this is like me letting people know that Black folks who are in senior leadership positions are actually doing that work. We're probably not telling you, but we are doing it to make sure that like that message is being sent across to staff, to volunteers, et cetera. But I think for white senior management, I think there's an integral role you have to play in making sure that you're winning white supremacy out of your policies and procedures. I won't considering time, I won't go into like a list of like how exactly you can do it, but I think focusing on making your organizations transformational instead of tokenizing is crucial. Tokenization is dehumanizing, and trust me, we've been through it, we've seen it. I think for myself, 28 years living in Canada, I've been through it and it's exhausting. And I think moving towards being transformational, knowing that like, even though you think things are great and like you have the most like progressive policies possible, there's still work to be done. And you can go over and beyond by just thinking about constantly wanting to improve and having that part of your culture is like wanting to learn. I think there are some organizations who don't do that, and they can definitely benefit from always constantly being in a mood for learning. And I think you'll definitely see the effect on not only everybody, but particularly Black folks who interact with your organization.
Thank you, all of you. I can't reiterate enough how beautiful it has been to hear all the things that you've shared. And what really comes to mind is we often blame the flower for not growing, but not the environment, not the soil in which it grows. And you know, we often individualize the lack of Black leadership. We just couldn't find the right people. We just couldn't bring in the right folks. This is the only person who applied, when there's actually so much work to do to fix the environment that Black people are experiencing within the sector. And Sarah, I really want to come back to this piece that you said. There's a clear difference between service delivery, right? Delivering services to Black communities, and policy and structural change around the institutional environment of a workspace. I think it's important for folks who are stuck there, and for everybody who maybe is like, I don't know, I've seen a lot of questions coming around, what do we do next? What are the actions? I'll reiterate what everybody has said here, which is there are incredible organizations, there are incredible leaders, and there are lots of examples out there of people doing this work in really good ways. Tap into them, resource them, and pay them to come in support you in doing this work. It's really, I think, what I've heard from all of you today. I'm going to shift tacks a little bit, which is interesting because when we talk about anti-Black racism as Black leaders, often we talk about what's not working, but I'm also really curious what personal values, besides, you know, the usual things that people ascribe onto Black people, you're resilient, you persevere, all those things are true, but what are some of the core values that you also carry with you in doing this work day to day that are important when committing to this work?
I think you have to be unashamed of being political. Like any Black leader who's like afraid to say something or do something, you're no better. You're no better than the white people in positions of power who aren't saying anything either. So at this point in time, you have to be unafraid of being political. Like keep tabs of what your governments are doing. Keep tabs of what younger people in your communities with no access to resources are going out there and trying to do to protect their communities, right? If you're a leader in a nonprofit sector and you're Black, like we need to start being political and leveraging our institutional protection as leaders in this sector to support the younger people on the ground who are carrying the brunt of the work. Because it's not us. Like any of us who are like high up in nonprofit worlds, it's never going to be us that are leading the revolution. And anybody who thinks that is on the wrong track. But what we can do is take our knowledge, our resources, our access to any sort of power at all, and start like funneling that into people and communities that are actually doing the work. We're not asking people on this call to solve all the issues. We're asking you to put your money up and your resources up.
I just love that. And I just want to add, you know, often, you know, we get stuck in this trap around service delivery, and we don't think about how we could be resourcing the anti-Black social movement. You know, there are things that we may have in our budget lines right now, whether it's training dollars that we could just be calling up, not another Black Lives, any group that's doing this work on the ground and saying, what kind of training do you need? We could slide it into our training budget. What kind of, all of those sorts of things. I think it's up to us, it's up to the sector to think about how do we resource those under-resourced social movements that are doing so much more work than we'll ever be able to do in our nonprofit organization.
Yeah, I think echoing what everyone has already said. So I think I'll answer this in two parts. First of all, the personally, who are you accountable? That's a question, accountable to. That's a question that I always ask myself with any work that I'm doing. Who do you answer to? My paycheck is paid by this organization, but who am I accountable to? And at the end of the day, I'm accountable to Black people. I'm accountable to Black freedom, I'm accountable to Black liberation. So all the work that I do must lead to that. And then secondly, I think I'm thinking about how we use our organizations to leverage better life for Black people. So I'm thinking, for example, even around, I work a lot in policy. When we are entering those halls where we're having meetings with government people, what type of policy am I putting on the table or am I recommending that will change Black people's lives? Thinking about something that's like around labor. Right now, a lot of the healthcare workers who are dying in this pandemic are Black and racialized people. A lot of them are people who are PSWs, so personal support workers, healthcare aides, custodians, cleaners. These are the people who also have the least protection. So in any discussion, I think that is happening right now around policy in COVID and recovery, we need to be making sure that we're talking about labor practices. We need to be making sure that we're talking about decent work and protections for these workers who often are the least protected. And that's actually a way that we address anti-Black racism, because we make the working conditions safer for our people who overwhelmingly are the ones who are in these sectors.
Yeah, and I think a lot of my co-panelists have shared a lot of the things that I feel, but I think when it comes to a value, I don't know if it is a value, but like for me, on top of being political, on like reminding myself, like, who am I serving? I'm also thinking of like myself. And I think there's something inherently political focusing on self-preservation. And like, to quote Audre Lorde, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. And I think for Black folks who are in this sector, who are leading things, we need to take care of ourselves, because that is a political act in itself. And I think we all are equipped to do some level of like harm reduction doing this work, because it's not easy, but like protecting ourselves and our survival is crucial. And it's a reminder I need to give myself, especially as someone who's a Black woman who was taught to give so much of myself to other people. And that's why I think it's a very political thing for me to take that time to take care of myself, to do self-care, whatever it looks like, to surround myself with other Black leaders, which I've in this role actively have tried to create, and creating spaces with other Black executive directors, but other Black leaders who are activists who I can learn from, and we can do knowledge exchange, because that for me is self-care too. And so I think self-preservation is crucial for a lot of us, and it is super political, way more than I think a lot of people think of it. It's like, it is an act of warfare that I carry with me on top of everything else.
Thank you, everybody. And like, can we have 3 hours? Is like always what's up to check. Can we have more time? I'm conscious of there's about 10 minutes left. There are a ton of questions. We won't get to all of them clearly today, but you know, talking about resourcing the work, maybe perhaps ONN can pay some folks to sit again and talk to folks about some of these questions, because they're all action oriented about what people can do within their organization. So perhaps there's some resources to be put behind some excellent Black folks who might be able to support organizations in doing this work moving forward. There is an interesting question that I think is about legacy building too. Someone's asked, what would you recommend as a way to retain Black staff so that they don't leave the organization, but also empower and guide and mentor Black staff to get to leadership positions? So what does a succession look like? And then I'll ask another question, and we'll do two at a time. What does it take for an organization to move from the beginning place of anti-racism training and a framework to actually embedding it as an organizational culture or a value in the way that you do your work? So I'll offer up those two questions, and you can answer maybe just one of them versus the two, and I'll try and get as many people, and then I think that's it. We'll look towards a wrap up.
I think one of the questions regarding retainment, but then also mentorship for Black staff. For me, I think, again, reflecting on my own personal experience, but then also what I'm trying to do mentoring other folks who are also racialized and Black as well, is not being afraid to have, to ask bold questions and to have bold conversations. And I think in the case where white senior staff or board members are trying to mentor, there is this I don't know, hesitancy to ask or say bold things. For example, in my organization, what hasn't happened is none of my board members have talked about the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is that Black women were harmed in the organization. We kind of just tiptoe around it. We're doing this anti-racism training. We've hired this Black woman, which in the Ottawa context it was received with a lot of like positive response, but there was never a bold enough question to be like, Debbie, how do you feel coming into this role, knowing what has happened, knowing that you're also leading our anti-racism action alongside us? And if that has happened, I think it would have given me the opportunity to be more comfortable to say exactly what I need to who needs to hear it. And I think that error, which it'll be amended however it does. I think learning from that is that not to be afraid to say those things. I know that there are white leaders who are starting conversations with racialized staff by saying, I recognize that I am a white person who I'm going to miss things and I'm not going to see certain things. And I want you to know that I am aware of the differences that we are going to have navigating this space. I just want you to know that. And that was part of the first conversation they had with a Black staff member who they hired. The Black staff member was shocked because it was just like, okay, but it's set up and it icebreaker to know, boom, immediately that there was that level of comfortability that person was invited into. And for me, I think we need to be bold enough to say those things and not to beat around the bush. And I know some people are like, oh, I don't want to say the wrong thing. And I think recognizing that you will say the wrong thing sometimes, that is just part of this work. And when you realize you do, apologize, do what you need to do to be accountable to whomever you may have harmed for saying the wrong thing, not intentionally harming people, but maybe the way you phrase something. But I think in showing that boldness, you open up the opportunity to mentor someone who doesn't look like you, which is not an easy thing for people to do these days. And so be bold.
I think I would also say sorry.
No, go ahead.
One of the ways to retain Black people in your organization, in my opinion, is not to focus on retention. Like, a lot of Black people know that it's like so difficult to move up. So I would say give people the skills that they need to leave, and make sure that if they're leaving, they're ending up somewhere better than they are now, right? And a lot of people are so focused on like, how do I make this person feel like they need to stay? The way to build trust and make people feel like they can stay is to like give them the skills that they need to leave and to grow, right? A lot of us get stuck, right? Especially in this sector, there's not a lot of places to like move up. So make sure that you're investing enough in your Black staff specifically so that they feel comfortable leaving into a better position. And then that means you're doing that work, and that in and of itself is a form of mentorship. But to just focus on retention on its own is kind of like self-serving, right? Especially if it's coming from white EDs. I don't think that's the route to go.
Yeah, Sarah, that's profound and wonderful, and I will be thinking about that a lot in my work as well.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about Christina Sharp, who is a prof at York, also has written brilliant work. Recommend people look into Christina Sharp. Wrote a really great book in 2016 called In the Wake, where she talks about that anti-Black racism, the climate is anti-Black. It's not just like a singular thing that pops up. The whole world that we live in is anti-Black. So I think that what I want to see in the nonprofit is bravery from white people, where you divest from white supremacy, leave it behind. Create workplaces where you are really saying, we are dismantling this. We understand that Black people are having to work in anti-Black climates, but what does it look like as an organization for us to actually do the work and to divest from this? And I think part of that is, as Sarah has said, creating workplaces where Black people feel like they can go on to thrive. But then I think some of it is also just listening to what Black people are saying. When Black people tell you that police harm us, we want less money to go to police budgets, don't stand there talking to us about, but we're safe. Like, no, Black people are telling you, we're not safe. We need a change in this situation. We need more money to be invested in other programs. Don't spend time arguing with us. The way that you divest from white supremacy is actually listening to us as we're having these conversations.
And as I find myself thinking about the impact of anti-Black racism, I try to pause and think about when I interact with anti-Black racism in my work what does it do for me? And one of the things that I realized is anti-Black racism is attempting to rob me of my joy. So I think it's so important that we prioritize space for Black joy, because so much of the conversations that we have about Blackness center around things that aren't joyful for Black folks. So, you know, when I work really closely with the ED of Black Creek Community Farm, Letitia Diawo, and one of the things we love to do is just catch up and kiki. Sometimes we're laughing at the stupid shit white people do. Sometimes we're just laughing because the work is hard and it's not, but we laugh and we find joy in each other and you know, supporting other Black folks. So I think making sure that we have space for joy and our laughter is important as well.
So I don't know if all of you have noticed as we've been talking, there are about 200 people who are on this panel and this call with us here today. We have 3 minutes before we move into the next piece, and it's again not nearly enough time. So I'll maybe just ask one person. I wonder, Sarah, if I could ask you to maybe share with us one action that you'd like people to take away from our conversation today.
3 minutes. I would just say, yeah, put your money up. Like, stop talking about combating racism and just people are doing the work. Right now, specifically, is an important time to fund it. And a lot of people on this call have access to resources. If not money, then other resources, relationships, leverage that to actually do something meaningful versus putting out meaningless statements. I think we're all exhausted by reading everybody's statements.
So tons of actions that people have shared with us today. There are action plans, there are templates, there are excellent people doing this work. Something I've been saying a lot of, no matter where I go, is this is a different contemporary moment. It doesn't matter if you're not interested in anti-racism work in your organization anymore. It doesn't matter if you bury your head in the sand. You know, as we say in my community, if you don't catch up, it'll catch you. So, and that catch is consequence oriented. People are calling for resignations. People are writing statements of action, letters of action to their board. People are doing investigations into what's happening in an organization. There's no more private sphere. Nonprofits, our charitable sector can no longer get away with the things that are happening behind closed doors. People are having conversations. And in particular, in case you didn't know it, I hope you know it now, Black people in this sector always talk about what's happening in all the nonprofit organizations. We all know the places we want to work and the places we stay away from. So you might not tell everybody, but we do. So it's again up to you how you choose to move forward in this moment. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to these incredible panelists, and not just people who are speaking, but also folks who are deeply engaged in this work. And thank you to all of you who have joined us today. Lots of great people. I think we're still